Welcome to Braden Navat. We are delighted to have our biggest competition, Spencer Case, who runs Microdigressions on the show. He's obviously one of our favorite guests because we have him on all the time. And if you enjoy his appearances on our show, well, then let me tell you what, go check out Microdigressions. Fantastic stuff. Clearly, I'm not a patriot because I'm punting Spencer way more than Braden Navat. Spencer, on the other hand, is going to be talking about patriotism. Take it away.
So my thought experiment derives from the song Imagine by John Lennon. I'm sure you're probably familiar with it. It's become something of a sort of secular cosmopolitan anthem. And it's from that perspective that patriotism is frequently criticized. So I'm going to read a couple excerpts from the lyrics, which I'm sure you've heard before. So the relevant bit is: Imagine there's no countries, it isn't hard to do, nothing to kill or die for, and no religion too. A little bit later, he says, Imagine no possessions, I wonder if you can, no need for greed or hunger, a brotherhood of man. Okay, so this song has gotten some criticism for its sort of utopian flavor. In the song The Other Side of Summer, Elvis Costello kind of has a shout back where he says, Was it a millionaire who said, Imagine no possessions? And yeah, it's easy to imagine John Lennon with no possessions or fewer possessions. But most of us ourselves would not want to be without possessions. And you might wonder whether a world without possessions is really a better world. One way of looking at that world is that we would all be impoverished. And I think you could look at the Imagine There's No Countries in a similar way. Um, Lennon seems to be imagining both possessions and national identities as things that are barriers to altruism, things that if they went away, that altruism would then spread globally, and there would be a lot more good feeling and companionship across humanity in the world. But that's not the way it would necessarily be. It might be that a world with no countries would make us all stateless, would make refugees of us all, in a sense. Now, there are people who've taken oaths of poverty and chosen to give up all possessions or all major possessions. I have a friend who did this, who was a monk. And there have also been people who've given up all citizenship. Albert Einstein did this. As a young man, he gave up his German citizenship, and it was later granted back without his even awareness, and certainly without his consent, when the German government wanted, positive association with his accomplishments. But most people don't want to be without possessions, and many people do not want to be without some kind of broader identity, some kind of broader membership, like a national membership or a tribal membership. So you could imagine this world with no countries. You could imagine the Wishmaster version of this, where Lenin gets his wish, but it's not what he imagines. There are no countries, but instead we're mired in tribal warfare. Like, we've got, instead of an expanding moral circle, the moral circle actually contracts into something smaller. There's more violence and more chaos. You could imagine him thinking, like, what's this? And you could imagine this with Imagine No Religion too. He thinks science and rationality would probably fill the void for religion, but you might have, folk magic taking its place instead. It depends on what your underlying assumptions about human nature are. So I raise this question to ask you, would the world really be better if there were no nations, if there were no countries?
So it's a really nice case because I did my PhD on the elimination of social groups, and it was the opening quote on the front of my of my PhD was exactly this quote from Lennon. Imagine there's no countries, it isn't hard to do. It's interesting that you've tied that to imagine there's no possessions. So it seems like you could build a coherent worldview where there are no countries, but there are possessions owned by individuals. And part of the issue that I have with groups is that, firstly, I don't think they exist, but let's put that problem aside. I don't think they're the kinds of things that can have possessions. So I don't think that groups can own things. I think only individuals can own things. But even if we put that metaphysical point aside, I think the world should be structured in such a way that groups don't possess anything, that only individuals possess anything. And free market capitalists like Mike Humer hold this view. Um, I mean, he might hold the view that there's corporate entities that could have possessions, but I assume he would also take it that those corporate entities are made up of individuals who together own what the corporation owns. Maybe he has a more robust view of corporations than that. I'm not sure. But the point is, it seems at least coherent to have a world with possessions but without countries, which wouldn't suffer the problems that you're talking about. And the kind of problems that you're talking about are these sort of like smaller tribal wars or these smaller communitarian wars, which Hume writes a lot about, and he discusses how that's just not something that's plausible in a world without a state or an overall nationhood. Instead, what he thinks would happen is you'd have people belonging to security companies, individuals that belong to security companies, and it would not be in those security companies' best interests to go to war with each other because wars are expensive. And so what you'd have instead is a collection, or not a collection, but a whole lot of security companies competing for the most efficient operation, and individuals would belong to each of those instead of wars. And that just seems like a more plausible outcome of a world without a nation state.
So you find the existence of groups suspect, but you don't find the existence of property sort of metaphysically suspect, because you could draw that metaphysically into question too. Nozick asks all sorts of weird questions about this, even though he's very pro-property in Anarchy, State, and Utopia. Like, if you own tomatoes and you make juice out of the tomatoes and dump it into the ocean, do you own the ocean? This kind of stuff. I'm curious why you'd be troubled about the metaphysics of groups, but not the metaphysics of property. And I want to follow up with this. If you want to say that property is like sort of, it's useful in a way that groups are not useful in some practical sense, I would like to know. I'd like to know why that would be. Why couldn't we take a similar instrumentalist approach to groups?
So I'm curious what the objections are that would apply to properties, to having a property, to possessing property. My view is basically that there are no social phenomena, that they don't exist, that they don't have utility. Not in the sense that there's no utility associated with social phenomena, but just that the utility is so low that a competing framework in which there's no social phenomena would be a better framework for understanding the world, a much better framework. So the kind of analogy I draw is witchcraft. So the theory of witchcraft has some utility associated with it, but it's also radically misleading. And when you replace theories about witchcraft with better scientific theories, you get a far better understanding of the world. And so believing in witchcraft, although it may provide you with some solace at times and it may get certain predictions right, will generally not. And so long as you believe that, you're missing out on a much better framework. Now, why could I believe in the existence of possessing property while at the same time not believe in the existence of social phenomena generally? Well, the question then would be whether possessing property is a social phenomenon. Um, I guess it's social in the sense that everyone around you would have to agree that you possess that property. So, in that sense, it's social, but it seems like it's a very thin sense of social because those beliefs that everyone has that I own this piece of property could just be reduced to a set of individual beliefs. Whereas we think that social phenomena are thicker than that generally. In other words, they believe they involve some sort of collective intentionality. So we are going to war. We are voting for this president. We are doing this. We are doing that. That's quite a thick sense of sociality versus Mark believes that I own this apartment. You believe that I own this apartment. I believe that I own this apartment. And that's sufficient for me to own this apartment.
Could your individual property be owned by multiple people? Like, could you gift a piece of land to Mark and Sean or something like that if you wanted to? So we would have co-ownership at that small level.
Yeah, I think I could. I mean, you're asking an interesting question because then does each of us own a part of it, or does the collective of us own all of it? Those are interesting questions, but I don't think they're too troubling from my view. You could have a corporation that's perfectly reducible to its individual parts, that seems fine. I don't think these are difficult cases for my view.
So I think Jason might have bitten a difficult bullet for himself, um, which is if we can imagine a corporation that owns vast tracts of land, huge amounts of vehicles, employs lots of people, has this massive structure, isn't just based in one country, but is a multinational all around the world. And you've got all these shareholders who are members of the corporation, and you say to the shareholder, so which stuff do you own? They say, I have no idea. I own shares in this company, and the company owns various things, and I could never really reduce that to particular items. If I sold my shares, I'd get some money out. You might think this starts to look a little bit like a nation state. That when you think about being a citizen of a country and saying, I have an ownership stake in its public goods. And, in South Africa, for example, our state owns certain things. There are certain state-owned entities, power stations, rail stations, things like that the state owns. And you might think that the citizens are shareholders and that they contribute towards its maintenance through taxes and they receive the benefits. It's more diffuse. But it seems that you can build up something that looks state-like off of Jason's framework. And then I suppose the question for Spencer is this a good thing? Like, should we support the state that we happen to be born into? I mean, I can say I no longer feel like being a shareholder in Coca-Cola. I want to support PepsiCo, and that's quite an easy thing to do. And I can feel strong feelings, on Wednesday for PepsiCo, and then start feeling badly about it and want to support Apple. Whereas if you're a citizen, the idea is that it's a bad thing if you suddenly start rooting for other nations.
I want to finish the thread that I had with Jason here. I ultimately think if those sorts of issues, if you can accommodate them on your view, then I think I can accommodate your view on my view. I think it's okay if we're fictionalists about countries, ultimately. Like, imagine somebody who is willing to make huge sacrifices on behalf of his country in some sense, like a Ukrainian soldier who's willing to risk his life to fight for the sovereignty of Ukraine, even though he thinks in some metaphysical sense Ukraine is a fiction, all countries are fictions. But I think just the world would be better if this fiction continued in something like its current sense. I think few of us would hesitate to call that person a patriot, especially if he thought of himself in that light.
So I take it that on your view, patriotism involves love of country. Could you love a fiction? I can love the Harry Potter books. That makes sense. I can love that these books were written. I can love how I feel when I read them. But it seems, firstly, like that's a different kind of love to the love of a being or a person. And a lot of people who believe in a thick sense of nations or countries see them as agents or as minds or as persons. So I love my country in the sense that I would love a person. It's just a very grand person that stretches over an enormous space and a lot of space and over long periods of time, which to me is just bizarre. But that seems to be what people have in mind. Could you love a piece of fiction that way? And then more importantly, could you love a particular character that way in a piece of fiction? Because that seems to be what's going on. If you're a fictionist about countries, could you love Harry Potter himself that way? Could you fall in love with Harry Potter? And is Harry Potter an agent? So that's the one sort of model you might have in mind. The other model you might have in mind is, I just love that this story is being told. It has positive utility. And so I want to propagate that story further. I want to fight for that story to continue. I'm going to sacrifice my life so that the utility of the story of Ukraine continues. That's odd. Would you sacrifice your life for Harry Potter? Like, for the story of Harry Potter? It just, I think no Ukrainian soldier who's doing anything beyond what he's forced to do would be doing it if you convinced him that Ukraine didn't exist.
Well, if you convinced him that Ukraine didn't exist in the sense that Vladimir Putin thinks Ukraine doesn't exist, but this is a different sense. And if it's true that this is going to be for the greater good, and that the narrative of Ukraine is something that is conducive of the greater good, then maybe that doesn't sound so absurd. This raises a lot of interesting questions about what precisely is the object of patriotic love. You love your country. I noticed, I realized the other day that as far as I know, nobody has been clear about this distinction between patriotic love as love for your country versus love for the people in it, the citizens who are not fictions, who would not be fictions, but they would be related to you in a certain way by your participation in creating this fiction. That would be a difference between the kind of fiction a country would be and like Harry Potter. I don't concede that countries are fictions, by the way, but I think they are social constructs on the same level of reality as like a currency would be. But here's an interesting thought experiment to try to pull these two things apart. I think that I guess I think a patriot is going to love both his country in some abstract sense and the people in it, because you can imagine a patriot, or a self-described patriot, being given the choice by God or a genie or some all-powerful force. I don't know. Would you like to make your country like really, really powerful, but all of its current members would die horrible deaths and be replaced by other members? I could imagine there would be some Romans who might say yes to that. But that seems pathological. I would not say that. I would not encourage anyone to adopt that kind of patriotism. Um, you could also imagine something that goes to the other extreme. You could take all of the members of your country and have them be dispersed to different countries and live wonderful lives, but then your country would no longer exist. It's also hard to imagine a reasonable patriot really wanting that outcome. There is going to be some kind of investment in the ongoing narrative of the country, because I think the narrative of a country is going to be something that a patriot is sort of like woven his own narrative into, his own self-conception, at least psychologically. So I think you've got two distinct objects here that need to be distinguished. There's the love of that ongoing social entity or narrative or fiction, if you want to think of it that way. And then there's the love for the particular people who are participating in it along with him. And I think it's the presence of those other people that makes the idea of sacrificing for a narrative or a fiction seem not so insane.
So I'm interested in who gets to be a patriot and what about. So if we think about how countries aren't always that homogenous, that they often have a variety of different groups inside of them, and that some of those groups might have belonged to other prior countries before they were absorbed or conquered. Um, as you mentioned, you could have, this case where there is a promise that a people will be given a land of their own, but all of the current members who are given that promise will die. It's the story of the Hebrews entering the promised land, right? So they all exit as one nation from Egypt in the hope of founding a new nation. But none of them ever enter. It's only their descendants. They sort of wander in the desert for 40 years, and Moses, who leads them, doesn't enter. So you can imagine the sense of saying, I'm patriotic to my group over time, persisting. And so you might think of that either in terms of national borders or in terms of some other kind of identity. If you think about the Druze, so the Druze have been around for about 1,000 years, and they live in Syria, Lebanon, and in Israel. And they're all patriotic to their respective countries. Their faith requires it of them that they show a fealty to the states in which they reside, not primarily to their faith. But it does seem that there are certain kinds of groups who are spread around the world or straddle different places, and you might think that they could be caught up in a twin allegiance, either to their state, or that they can say, I'm a patriot to this other sub-nation that's not about country borders. I will fight for the Romani people regardless of where we live.
Having allegiance to whatever country you're in seems like a pretty good strategy for a group like the Druze that are not, I believe, strong enough or powerful enough to have their own country, and it might not be desirable. I do think that the national identity shouldn't be all consuming, right? It ought to be something that's compatible with other loyalties. Um, and so I also would say, and this might be a point of departure from a lot of defenders of patriotism who want to say something stronger than this, but I don't necessarily think you ought to be stuck with wherever you're born. Um, Often it is the case that people do have a sense of loyalty and special attachment to the places that they're from. I think only like 4% of the world is living away from the country that they were originally born in, on an ongoing basis. It's a surprisingly small number considering how globalized we are. And I should say, I think countries generally go better when people are patriotic in the sense that, and I'm using an older sense of the word patriotism here, in the sense that people are willing to transcend their own partisan interests for the good of that country and that group, setting aside like political interests, career interests, and that kind of thing. Don't damage your country in pursuit of your own good. I think it would be good if more people were like that. But I don't think that there's anything really essential about sticking with the group that you were born in, right? Um, in fact, I've actually wondered whether this would be a reform that would make the world better. Like, suppose I'll just take the U.S. for example, but I could imagine this happening everywhere. So, in the U.S., like immigrants have to take like a citizenship oath when they become naturalized. What if, upon entering into adulthood, you had a choice? You could either swear in and take the same kind of oath that the immigrants who became naturalized would take, or you could renounce your citizenship and here's $50,000. Go somewhere else. Have a nice life. No hard feelings. If you really like Scandinavia, uh, go to one of those countries. But I mean, I think, but then there would be more loyalty within the country as it exists. It would be more like an actual social contract. Um, so social contract in the sense of establishing the authority of the government through consent, right? This is notoriously criticized by the obvious observation that people don't actually consent to this. But as a matter of fact, quite a lot of people do take oaths to their countries in various capacities. I took an oath to uphold and defend the U.S. Constitution from enemies, foreign and domestic, when I entered into the military in the U.S. Army in 2004. That remains in effect. I'm actually not sure what percentage of Americans have taken oaths like this, but we could imagine society being more sort of consensual and contractual by spreading this out. People take oaths, and you're actually given a choice, so it's not like you're forced into it. I think that might actually be an improvement to the current arrangements.
So I'm curious, when you say that when you feel patriotic, what you're doing is you're saying that I love the people in my country. Um, that's odd to me for two reasons. The one is the case that Mark gave. So you can imagine cases where you perform enormously patriotic acts for a future generation and not for anyone that you currently know. So the Hebrews leaving Egypt and going to Israel is a nice example. I have no idea whether that's historically accurate, but it's certainly plausible as a case. The other reason is it just seems false to say that I love all the people in my country. You don't even know who they are. You've never met the vast, vast, vast majority of them. You may never have left your hometown. Or if you're an immigrant, you may not have met anyone but the boat of other immigrants with which you arrived. So it just seems false to say that the love of country is the love of the people in it. At least it's false if that love is considered de re, in other words, about the particular individuals involved. Maybe what you mean is a de dicto sense of love. So maybe what you mean is, I love the people in this country. In other words, not these particular individuals where you list the whole set of Americans. What you mean is, I love anyone who satisfies the description, I'm an American. But then it seems like that kind of love is just irrational, right? It seems like, well, why love that set of people? Why love the people who satisfy that description and not another set of people who satisfy a different description, which is the set of people who live in Britain, for example, who are British? It's also circular, because it seems like when you say I'm patriotic, what does that mean? Well, it means that I love the people in my nation. And well, what is that love? Well, it's the love for the people in my nation. So I love the people in my nation because they're in my nation. Just seems circular or irrational or unsupported. Then you say, okay, but I'm not tying you to a particular place. You could move, right? You could move to Britain and love those people instead, and that would be equally rational. But then why is love for any given set rational? Then you say, okay, it's rational because it means that you are transcending your own set of needs and desires and self-interest, and you're expanding the circle of your interest to a larger group, which is this group of people in a country. Well, a lot of people would say that's a partisan set of interests as well. That was the reasoning behind John Lennon's song. He was saying, well, the problem is people seem to care about the interests of the people in their geography, but not in geographies outside of them. And I mean, he was referencing the Vietnam War, and how Americans weren't caring about the interests of the Vietnamese. Why? Just because they weren't in the same country as them. So I'm trying to make sense of the rationality of patriotism. Like, why does it make sense to have it? And to my mind, the only answer you can give that makes any sense is an answer that Lionel Shriver gave on a different episode that we had, where we discussed her love of her country in terms of her love of a certain culture. And that seems like the only thing that persists through time. It's not certain individuals in that country that persist, because they come and go, they die out, they have children, but a culture persists. And her problem with immigration is that it shifts the culture, and that she feels is a real threat to her patriotism. So is that what you're really talking about? Is it a love of culture?
I think cultural continuity has a lot to do with it. It would be hard to have the right kind of identification for a country that had no stable culture over time. I don't want to say that's all there is to it. I do want to resist the claim that you can't love people de re if you haven't met them. I think that they're just different kinds of love. I mean, I think you can imagine somebody, um, a politician who actually intends well. I know that's a stretch even for this show, but let's just suppose, and it doesn't need to be a whole country. Let's make it, somebody who's running for like a state office. Like, I really care about the interests of my constituents. This person's receptive to, hearing emails of people talking about their problems where the government might be involved in coming up with some sort of solution. That doesn't strike me as being irrational. I think it starts to seem irrational if we insist on too strict of an analogy with interpersonal love. But I do think we have the capacity to empathize with people in a deep way who we haven't met. Um, and I don't think all of that is irrational. It can go in very irrational directions. I'm thinking a lot lately about the reaction in the United States to 9/11, which this is now what I'm actually beginning my book on patriotism talking about, because this was, for anyone in my generation or older, this is sort of a high point, high watermark of patriotic sentiment. Um, and there's a good debate to be had, I think, about whether that became corrupted over time and sort of degenerated into patriotism kitsch, which certainly, covered the culture for a while. Um, or whether there was really something there to begin with that's worth sort of salvaging and defending. And I would want to say that. I remember when that happened, I was in Idaho, and obviously the planes hit the buildings in New York and DC, and one landed in Pennsylvania. And yet it had this strong feeling of like this was almost a local tragedy. This could have happened here in an emotional sense. We felt like it had this immediacy, and there really was feeling for actual people, actual victims, and I don't think that was unreasonable. Now, the question isn't it another kind of partisanship? Ultimately, this is the fundamental criticism of patriotism, and I think in a way the answer is yes. But I think maybe it's okay. Why might it be okay? Well, you can come up with cases in which the interests of one's country are strongly at variance with the greater good. But I actually think they're quite rare, even materially, right? I think starting unjust wars is generally bad for your country and for the common good. Um, I think also caring for your country and your fellow citizens involves caring about their moral status and their moral standing too. So, like, just as I wouldn't want my son to conquer the world and be a warlord, um, my caring about him it involves a concern about his moral well-being and his moral behavior. I think that's true of countries as well. There might be cases, however, where there is a genuine conflict between the long-term interests of one's country and what's morally right. I don't think it happens nearly as often as the critics of patriotism suggest, but here's one case that where that might be true, especially if you are skeptical of this kind of moral prudential entanglement that I'm describing. So this is a case from ancient history in Rome in the Third Punic War. They had fought these two wars with the rival city Carthage, and in the third one, they just had the upper hand and realized we can just destroy this city that is at this point not a threat to us, and then we would have no rival in the area. Um, okay, that seems to me horrendously wrong, and I think if there is indeed a conflict between patriotism and if the patriotic thing would be to destroy Carthage, then I would say you shouldn't do the patriotic thing in that case, right? You should. It's not going to be an overriding good in all cases, right? Just as like I wouldn't do absolutely everything I can to out of love for my son. There've got to be limits to this sort of thing.
So I suppose the question is how much weight we grant the patriot. So it's one thing to say that a patriot will make sacrifices for the good of their nation. That doesn't involve any conflict of goods but the patriots. In other words, he's saying, I'm going to dedicate my time or I'm going to dedicate my money or my other skills and resources for the sake of the nation. But as you say, when you butt heads with another nation, then you could say, well, does the patriot back it? Does the patriot say, well, because I'm a patriot and I don't want my country to sully its good reputation, I'm going to protest it? So, you can imagine the Vietnam War protester who says, well, in the eyes of the world, when America, dropped Agent Orange on people, it sullied its reputation. And because I love my country so much, I'm going to call for an end to this war, not because I care about Vietnamese people, but because I care about America and its reputation. So you can imagine someone doing that. Or you could say, no, those other people matter and they matter a lot. And despite the fact that I'm a patriot, I think what's happening is wrong. And I'm abandoning my country's cause and I'm going to, be critical of it. And so it'll be in tension with my patriotism.
I think a patriot could oppose an unjust war for both reasons. It's terrible that it's happening to my country, and it's also, I feel bad for the suffering of the people who are being affected by this. I don't think it's got to be one or the other. I do think that it does make sense, at least on an emotional level. I can definitely make sense of the attitude that's sometimes expressed with the slogan "Not in my name," like the fact that something terrible is happening, um, and the country that I identify with is the agent of that evil. It might hit me especially hard and might stir um, a special kind of responsibility to stop it. I don't know that I have a worked out view of whether I in fact would have, like, as a basic moral fact, like special responsibility, um, given my relatedness to the group that is doing something bad, or whether it would just more be a matter of the fact that, because this is my country, I'm more well placed to do something about it. And criticisms that come from a place of love just generally tend to be more forceful than criticisms that do not, right? I think the whole dissent is patriotic. I think that slogan has been abused and overused and kind of become stale, because there's certainly forms of dissent that are not patriotic. Not absolutely every criticism comes from a place of love, but many of them do, and those ones have special force. So, in a sense, you'd be better situated to do something about that, an unjust war, some other unjust policy, if you did love your country.
You you think patriotism is a good thing, but you think patriotism should be correctly characterized. So the current characterization among many critics of it is that it involves a one-upmanship of other nations. So it involves beating other nations in some way, in some sense, being superior in some way. Maybe through a war, maybe just through a set of properties, you feel that your country is superior. Um, but your notion of patriotism is different. Your notion of patriotism is that it involves transcending your own limited self interest and becoming interested in the interests of the people in your country as a whole. And it involves doing what is good for the country, not just for you. And that is a good thing because it is more selfless than it would be if you were just acting in your own self interest. So now I'm curious. Um, can you be patriotic towards a country that you've never lived in, or maybe never even visited? You said that you understand the notion that someone could move countries and then feel patriotic towards the new country in which they reside. But could you feel patriotic towards a country that you've never lived in or even visited? The case I have in mind is a friend of mine. He became obsessed with Italy. He studied Italy as a university subject. Italian, it was called Italian studies. So he studied the country, he studied its literature, language, and just developed what appeared to be a love of country. He is now in Italy, but this was before he was in Italy, and he just loved everything Italy, the food, the poetry, the everything. Is that rational? Is it rational to, on your view of patriotism, is that patriotism, firstly? And secondly, is it as good as the patriotism that you would have for a country in which you were born?
Simon Keller brings up exactly this kind of case, and he says, in his anti-patriotism position, he says we shouldn't consider a person like this a patriot. In this case of Italy, I agree with that. I think that once we spell out in more detail what is meant by it, there has to be a certain kind of you love it as an insider, so to speak, as a member. Um, Now, could it be as good as patriotism? In all likelihood, probably not. I mean, is this person going to ever be running for office in Italy and realizing, oh, I could do this dirty move that would damage Italy's institutions, but it would one up my opponent? And presumably this person's not going to be in that situation. So I think that it is unlikely to be as conducive to the national good as as patriotism would be. I guess, it's very common to bring up these sort of interpersonal or domestic analogies with patriotism. Sometimes they have their weaknesses, but I do think that there's something about loving someone as a member of their family. I don't want to diminish friendship or other kinds of love, but it does seem to me that the lack of that kind of relationship might be a particular kind of loss, and I might be able to influence a member of my family in a positive way because we have some sort of special connection. And I'm imagining something similar, like on a larger scale, being true here.
I like the analogy with the family, and you might think that you owe members of your family some um, loyalty arrangement. So you should back members of your family over others, even under a situation where the other side has a better point. You might think, that loyalty requires you to some degree to favor your family members. And you might think that you should be loyal to your sports team, so that you should cheer for them even when they do some things that are a bit bad, even when they not playing quite by the rules. You should still be loyal to them and not just swap sides. But there must come a point at which your loyalty becomes toxic. So you think about people who are loyal to their particular gang and are willing to kill people because of that loyalty. We'd think, well, it's pretty bad that you're loyal. It's a contingent virtue. It's not necessarily good on its own. Once we add it to other things, it becomes quite dangerous. And so, of course, the worry with the patriot is that they love their country too much, and they're not only willing to make sacrifices of themselves, but they're willing to sacrifice all sorts of other good things for their country. And so I wonder, if we think that loyalty gives you a bit of a buff in terms of things that you can do, how far can the patriot go? And then I also wondered, which there's a point where one ought to renounce the idea of being a patriot. When your country has done enough things that are so despicable that you should say, I feel no sense of patriotism to this place anymore. I renounce it. I spit on it. Or another sense in which you say, I feel patriotism for what my country once was. And I'm so disgusted with what it has become that my patriotic duty is to, take very harsh steps, maybe even to go and storm its Capitol building because of how far it has strayed from its, earlier virtuous state.
Let me say something about how I would be thinking about the interpersonal case, right? Say a family member of mine is in an argument with someone else, and I kind of see the other person's point. I would certainly feel the impulse to nonetheless come to, say, my brother's defense or something like that. Here's what would be going through my head is that, okay, there's the weight of whatever issue is at stake in this argument. And then there's also this relationship between me and my brother that might be tarnished if I didn't come to his defense. So I would need to be thinking of, like, how serious is the issue. If the issue was serious enough, I shouldn't come to his defense. I should say, bro, uh, take a seat. You got to hear some news you don't want to necessarily hear, but this other guy's got a point about whatever it is. But not everything is that serious. If it's just some minor thing, the show of loyalty might be better overall. Now, when is it permissible to not be a patriot anymore? I'm fairly permissive with that. I think if you do give up patriotism for your country, you ought to find another collective that you care about and are trying to contribute to the good of. But I'm fairly permissive about people doing that. I mean, even in the case of the Nazis, you had the Colonel, let's see, von Clausen, I think, or von Straffen, who attempted to assassinate Hitler, and his final words were "for sacred Germany." Now, you might think that that wasn't the right motive for assassinating Hitler. Primo Levi in the book "The Drowned and the Saved" says at the beginning of that book, they bestirred themselves too late, but I think it's noteworthy that they bestirred themselves at all, when most of their contemporaries did nothing. So I think there's definitely a comprehensible narrative that a German patriot in World War II could make, where the Nazis were the real enemy of Germany. This is why I actually think Nazism is not a good counterexample to patriotism being good, because they were just so clearly bad for their own country in so many ways. And it's easy, I think, to have something for the patriot to say about that kind of case. Now, although I could also understand somebody saying, "I'm done with this. I'm going somewhere else." That's completely understandable. I think a case that is a little bit different is the case of the Confederate States that seceded from the U.S., formed this new Confederate state. I think it counts as a country, even though Lincoln vociferously denied it. They never had foreign recognition, but they had everything else in their brief existence that would be a sign of it being a country. They had a currency and a president and a constitution and all that. Now, it's very clear that it's the entire existence of the Confederacy was to preserve slavery, keep it going. That was the purpose. That's why they seceded. That's why they formed this other unity. And so, the German patriot under Hitler can recall this much longer cultural existence of Germany, and imagine a much better future for Germany. That's not really the case with the Confederacy, as far as I can tell, right? Its existence was based on one particular cause. That cause was evil, and there was no anticipation of it getting better in the future. In fact, its whole point was to keep it where it was. So I would want to say that might be a case where that you just should not be a patriot to that entity at all. You should want it destroyed. Not the states that are within it. I mean, maybe something better to say would be, actually, maybe your loyalty is to your state. And if that's where your loyalty is, you should see that your state is better off in the United States than in this Confederacy for both prudential and moral reasons.
Have you considered the following objection to your account of patriotism? So, the invisible hand argument says that if you want to construct the best society possible, you should really allow people to act in their own self-interest without telling them what they should do to sacrifice for the greater good. When you do that on aggregate, when everyone is acting in their own self-interest, you get the best outcome for society as a whole. So this is the invisible hand line of thinking. Now, on your view, love of country involves transcending your own self-interest in favor of the interest of your country. But on the invisible hand argument, those two set of self-interests are the same, at least in aggregate. So it seems like if you buy into the invisible hand argument, then patriotism is sort of redundant. It means nothing more than just following your own self-interests.
Well, if it was really true that your self-interest was always conducive to the greater good in this way, then yes, it would be redundant. But I don't think that that's true. I don't think that's anything Adam Smith ever said. I mean, he thought that economic transactions in markets that had certain regulations in place, those could be conducive to the greater good. But he was pretty clear about other selfish motives not being in the interest of the state, not being in the interest of the collective. So I guess I would just be inclined to say that that's what you call the invisible hand position overstates things considerably.
So there's a interesting tension in Europe about whether you ought to have this community of nations, maybe one that could be ultimately dissolved, that you just have one mega country of Europe, but you have the EU and you have some sense of internal sovereignty. And then there's also a fair amount of rebellion to that idea. So The British said we want out, and they got out. A lot of parties that are Eurosceptics have done very well in recent elections, and the EU. Does it make sense to be patriotic to some kind of supranational body, to say that I care about the EU, or is that a kind of incomprehensible concept in a way that's different from, I'm proud to be French?
In principle, you could have something like that. There was an interesting exchange between Sigmund Freud and Albert Einstein. Einstein is almost the sort of the epitome of a cosmopolitan. He thought, we're all human beings. He had his perspective was not that far off of John Lennon's, actually. But Freud said something very interesting in a letter to him. He says, we're living beyond our psychological means, meaning that he thought, even back then, that the kind of internationalism was making demands on human psychology that were not realistic. That for these sort of national communities to function, they had to be rooted in a sense of usness, or sometimes that is based on ethnicity, sometimes it's based on other kinds of shared history. And I admit, and I think everyone should admit, there's nothing fundamentally rational about that, like how far our sense of usness extends. It's kind of just a brute psychological fact, but I think these are psychological facts that we need to respect in building institutions, in the same way that we need to respect human self-interestedness in deciding what our economic structure is going to be like. As a matter of fact, people just are not as altruistic as I think John Lennon would like to believe, and that other people have wanted to believe. And we are in fact driven by self-interested economic motives. I think there's something similar here with regard to group identification. Like, as a matter of fact, it just is important to people to be a member of a larger group. Although I think countries have certain economic functions, right? Like they provide public goods of various sorts. They can provide security. I don't actually think that that's the fundamental reason that like countries exist. I think they are satisfying something more primal in human beings, and we might wish that humans were not primal in this sort of way, just as we might wish that humans were not quite so self-interested. But I think we need to reckon with the fact that people are like this. And I see one danger of cosmopolitanism. It doesn't respect enough the primal in human psychology, which is it's easy not to respect it because it doesn't seem like a very respectable thing. It seems like maybe a relic of our evolutionary past that we feel sort of ashamed of. But there's a danger in not respecting it. In that, if we insist that Europe is going to be just one country, but Swedes and Brits and French and all of these different groups of people don't feel like they're one country, it's going to be more difficult for people to make those kinds of sacrifices for the greater good that people are going to occasionally, and maybe not so occasionally, quite regularly need to make if this is going to be a functioning polity.
So, if I understand correctly, what you're saying is there's just a limit to our psychological capacity to envision our us as bigger and bigger and bigger. Um, and so that limit coincides roughly with the nation state. That's as big as we can get. And so that's what we should settle for. But there's really nice examples of this just not being the case in a widespread way. And that is utilitarian notions of well-being and utility that extend to the whole of humanity and beyond, to animals as well. So Mark is a vegetarian, and we've had endless arguments about this. And Mark thinks that the well-being of animals is important and it matters to him. He doesn't have any pets, but he cares deeply when an animal is harmed or suffers in a way that's unnecessary. And a lot of philosophers are vegetarians. A lot of people in the world over the last few decades have become vegetarians. I'm not a vegetarian, so obviously my empathy seems to be limited. But there's a lot of people who do seem to experience empathy for beings not just of their own species, but even beyond. And if that's the case, then surely your view should be, well, patriotism has value, but it's not as valuable as utilitarianism, as morality.
I think contrasting patriotism with morality, it reminds me of something that Martha Nussbaum says is the cosmopolitan is someone who chooses right over country. And I thought, well, yes, of course, choose right over country when they conflict. I don't think that they conflict as often as cosmopolitans believe. And just like you should always choose the right thing over being a good father, I suppose, but typically being a good father is a way of doing the right thing. Um, I'm also a vegetarian. I also favor expanding the moral circle beyond human beings to all sentient animals. And I I think that those goals can be furthered within the structure of nation states that exist. Now, you said something very interesting, and I want to make clear I'm not committed to saying this, which is that nation states as they currently exist are as big as they can get. I mean, I don't think we know that. Um, I mean, when the American Constitution was being debated, one of the big issues that the Federalists had to contend with was the fact that the largest democracies that they were aware of were city states. And there was this worry that that as the country got larger, um, it wouldn't be sustainable as a republic. I don't think that we're in a position to be able to project like how large a country could be. Um, but that doesn't mean that there are currently existing limits that we currently have to respect. Um, I think if we just declared there to be a world government, we're all citizens of the world in like a literal sense, people would think, okay, so is the capital? Is it going to be in D.C.? Is it going to be in Beijing? Like, who's really going to be running this world? And it would kind of be a facade. Uh, Similarly, there was an act. I think it was the Kellogg-Briand Pact. I think from the 1920s that declared war illegal. It's like, okay, yeah, you can say that on a piece of paper. Will it actually carry weight and resonance with humans as they are currently arranged? Maybe not. But I don't want to be dismissive about the possibility that eventually, all human beings, the cultures of the world could merge in such a way that there really is a global culture and a global sense of usness. Um, I do kind of suspect that there's something human about wanting to be part of a community that's distinct, that is, which implies wanting there to be some other. And I think that's actually a good thing, right? I think there's nothing inherently better about like the collectivism of like Chinese culture as compared to the individualism of American culture. I think there are pluses and minuses to each, and it's difficult to say which is better. And I think it's probably better that there be a plurality of societies and a plurality of countries where people have different ways of living in order to realize, different worthwhile human communities. So I don't think that there ever will be an ultimate convergence on a global society, but I also can't rule it out. It's sort of an open empirical question.
Well, Spencer, it's always a delight having you on the show. I want to say that at Brain of Vat, we like building up a sense of community. So we absolutely treasure the comments we get in the section on YouTube. So please leave us a comment. Tell us where you're from. Tell us whether you love your country and which countries you hate. And if you're listening to us on Spotify, please send us a comment as well. You have the ability to send us a voice note so we can hear your wonderful voices. It's an incredible feature of technology that you don't just have to listen to us drone on. We can hear you drone on. So please embark on your duty as citizens. Be patriots to Brain and Avat. And when you get a chance, please go and send your invading forces to go and wipe out microaggressions, those sniveling swine